Edwin Vane gave Adelaide Rowan until the schoolroom clock struck 6 to choose which lie would govern the rest of her life. Rain pressed against the tall windows, blurring the brick towers of Vane's cotton mill. The evening pupils had been dismissed early, but blue lint remained on the benches where 40 young women usually sat after their shifts. Vane stood beside the cold hearth, immaculate in black, while his solicitor, Mr. Pritchard, arranged 2 papers on Adelaide's desk. "You were engaged to teach letters suitable to their station," Vane said, "not to turn my hands against me." Adelaide kept one palm on the arithmetic book she had written herself. "I taught them to read the deductions on their wage slips. If the figures turn them against you, Mr. Vane, the fault is not in the lesson." Vane's mouth tightened. He announced that Adelaide had encouraged insolence, neglected approved scripture lessons, and made private copies of mill accounts. If she signed the first paper, she must admit that her wage lessons were false, and that she had provoked unrest. She would receive 1 month's pay and a neutral reference, but never teach a Vane employee again. If she refused, she would leave that night without salary, reference, or the 2 rooms provided with her post. His solicitor, Mr. Pritchard, laid 2 papers before her. One was a confession. The other was a deed to Brackenmere Pottery, an abandoned works beyond the canal, transferred in settlement of every claim she might make against Vane. Adelaide did not touch the confession. Her mother, Miriam Rowan, had taught her that heat exposed weakness in badly prepared clay. Pressure did the same to people. "The pottery owes £43 in rates," Pritchard warned. "Its roof is unsound, its clay pits are fouled, and the borough has ordered demolition within a fortnight." Vane smiled without warmth. The second paper was his jest disguised as compensation. A deed to Brackenmere Pottery, an abandoned works beyond the canal, transferred in settlement of every claim she might make against him. He had purchased its debts years before, and evidently considered the ruin an elegant punishment. Adelaide read both documents once more, then pushed the confession away. "I will take the pottery." Vane's confidence faltered for only an instant. Pritchard summoned 2 overseers to witness the transfer. Adelaide signed beneath Vane, using the steel pen her mother had once used to mark glaze recipes. When the solicitor surrendered the rusted keys, the schoolroom clock began to strike 6. "A roof-leaf kiln will not care how well you read." "No," she said, "but records often survive the men who fear them." She climbed to her rooms and packed 1 carpet bag. Beneath her mother's wooden glaze box lay a narrow pattern book bound in cracked green cloth. Miriam had filled it with borders for plates and tiles. Leaves, chains, stars, and geometric bands, each accompanied by color ratios and firing notes. Adelaide added it to the bag and left before the final clock stroke faded. 19-year-old Nell Cooper waited beneath the dripping school arch and pressed a wrapped loaf into her hands. News traveled quickly through a mill. Nell's wages supported 2 younger brothers. Gratitude could cost her dearly. "Do not follow me," Adelaide whispered. "You taught us to add," Nell replied. "We can also count what he has taken." Brackenmere Pottery stood a mile beyond the final mill cottages, enclosed by a wall bowed toward the canal. 3 bottle kilns rose above roofless workshops like blackened towers. The gate hung from 1 hinge. Nettles swallowed the courtyard, rain poured through the counting-house ceiling, and a red demolition notice had been nailed across the main door. Adelaide entered before dusk. She knew enough of buildings to fear the sagging rafters, and enough of pottery to recognize neglect that had been arranged to look like failure. Saggers lay smashed in deliberate heaps. Copper from the drying house pipes had been stripped, yet the brass hinges on the largest kiln remained. 1 range of painters' windows was boarded from within. She chose the old decorating room for shelter because its stone floor was level and 1 corner remained dry. Before unpacking, she measured it for benches. If the roof could be patched, she could at least continue teaching. The outer wall extended farther toward the great kiln than the interior allowed. Adelaide checked twice, then opened Miriam's pattern book to use its ruled margin for figures. A painted border on the facing page contained a sequence of rectangles whose proportions matched the missing distance. Beneath flaking whitewash, in the room itself ran the same border in small cream tiles, each painted with a blue leaf and a black initial. Her mother had once described such workers' marks. A painter received credit for every sound piece that left the kiln. Adelaide cleaned soot from one tile. Mr. Her breath caught. Miriam Rowan had worked at Brackenmere before Adelaide's birth, but she had never said her mark remained in its walls. Outside, iron scraped against brick. Adelaide took the shuttered lamp and crossed the yard. A man fled through a gap in the wall. At the great kiln, pale scratches showed where a crowbar had tested bricks around the iron wicket. Those bricks were smooth, machine-cut, and scarcely 10 years old. The kiln surrounding them had been built by hand half a century earlier. Someone had sealed the opening long after Brackenmere closed. Someone had returned that evening to open it before she could. Adelaide slept little. At dawn, she made a complete, measured survey, as her mother had taught her when calculating the volume of a firing chamber. The kiln house measured 31 feet outside and only 27 within. 4 feet had vanished behind the sealed wicket and a false inner wall, the exact proportion embedded in Miriam's border. She did not attack it blindly. A kiln under strain could collapse inward and bury her. Morning made the ruin less frightening and more exact. The long dipping house had lost half its roof, but its north wall still stood plumb. The thrower's room contained 6 wheel pits filled with plaster and rubbish. Rain had entered the molding loft for so many years that elder saplings grew between the flags. Yet deliberate damage differed from decay. Roof lead had been cut cleanly where it could have been peeled back without harming the brick. Account cupboards had been emptied, then their doors rehung. Every clay sample was smashed, while common chairs and iron tools remained untouched. Adelaide drew the property on the reverse of an old lesson chart. She marked unsafe ranges with crosses, usable drains with blue lines, and every sign of purposeful removal with a circle. Her mother had insisted upon such discipline. Miriam could look at a blistered plate and reconstruct every careless hour of its making, but she never guessed when evidence could be measured. In the counting house, Adelaide found a drawer jammed behind a fallen lintel. It contained no books, only square paper labels printed with the Brackenmere crest. Each had a space for a worker's mark, firing number, quality grade, and share credit. A pottery run solely for an owner's profit had no need to record share credit. She slipped one label into her glaze box and left the others undisturbed. At the canal boundary, she discovered another inconsistency. The deed described free access to a loading stage 20 feet wide, but Vane's warehouse fence enclosed half of it. New iron posts had been driven through older socket stones. Without the full stage, coal carts could not turn, and finished ware could not be loaded efficiently. The supposedly worthless pottery had been made impractical by encroachment as well as neglect. She heard boys calling from the towpath. They dared one another to climb the wall and see the mad teacher living among ghosts. Adelaide invited them through the gate instead, and offered a penny for every intact roof slate carried to the decorating room. Their mockery became bargaining. By noon they had stacked 31 slates and reported that a gentleman's foreman had measured the great kiln 2 days before Adelaide received the deed. That detail troubled her most. Vane had expected her refusal, yet prepared for her acceptance. Instead, she carried her deed to the borough office. The clerk, Thomas Bell, was a narrow, cautious man with clay-colored whiskers. He confirmed the rates and the demolition order, but when Adelaide asked for the original survey, he found only a later copy prepared by Edwin Vane's estate office. The old plan was withdrawn in 1861, Bell said, by whom the index does not record. Brackenmere ceased firing in 1857. Why survey it 4 years later? Bell glanced toward the door. You have 12 days to make one building safe or satisfy the committee that demolition would destroy an asset of public value. I advise you to concern yourself with timber, Miss Rowan, not history. She spent her last 12 shillings on tarred canvas, nails, lamp oil, and the hire of a handcart. Samuel Pike, An elderly thrower whose left hand had stiffened in an accident watched her patch the decorating room roof alone. By noon he climbed the ladder without asking and showed her how to brace the rotten purlin rather than burden it. Pike worked without wasting movement. He cut wedges from a broken wearboard, tested each joist with the handle of his hammer, and refused to stand beneath plaster that sounded hollow. His left fingers curled uselessly, but his right hand tied knots as neatly as a sailor's. When Adelaide thanked him, he asked whether gratitude could be baked hard enough to keep out rain. She offered him tea instead. They boiled water in a blackened copper over the restored grate and ate Nell's remaining bread. Pike studied Adelaide's survey, correcting the name of the dipping house and drawing a narrow passage that no longer existed between the model shop and the great kiln. "Why was it closed?" Adelaide asked. "After Mr. Renford died, they said the wall had shifted. Men were paid to brick it in. Not Brackenmere men." "Who paid them?" "The trustees." Pike would not yet name them. Fear had become a habit practiced over 19 years. Adelaide did not press. Instead, she showed him the share credit label. He held it close to the window, and the contempt in his lined face gave way to grief. "We surrendered a penny in every shilling," he said. "More when orders were good. Renford matched it. The fund was to purchase the works, then build a school and sick room. After the fire, they told us the fund had paid creditors. At Vane's mill, a penny could decide whether a family bought lamp oil. 100 workers surrendering it week after week would have created more than a sentimental promise. It would have created an ownership claim worth erasing. Your mother would have chosen the same room, he said afterward. Adelaide nearly dropped a nail. Pike had known Miriam as the finest glaze mixer at Brackenmere. He also remembered its owner, Josiah Renford, promising to place the pottery in trust for the workers after a new smokeless kiln made the works profitable. Then Renford died, the patent drawings disappeared, and the trustees declared the pottery insolvent. Who were the trustees? Pike looked toward the mill chimneys. Edwin Vane's father and Pritchard's predecessor. That evening, Adelaide examined every marked tile. The initials did not repeat at regular intervals. Some leaves pointed left, others right. Their blue varied from pale wash to deep cobalt. Her mother had trained her to see kiln temperature and color. The differences were not careless painting. They formed groups. She remembered standing at Miriam's work table at 8 years old, forbidden to touch the bowls but permitted to grind a failed shard beneath a stone. Her mother had shown her how cobalt could appear nearly black before firing and bloom blue only after heat, how iron contamination dulled a clean glaze, and how a maker hid knowledge from careless imitators in the order of ordinary actions. Miriam never called those evenings an apprenticeship. Respectable schools did not value knowledge obtained beside kilns, and Miriam wanted her daughter to pass examinations rather than breathe dust. Yet Adelaide had learned ratios before algebra and observation before rhetoric. One memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Miriam had once painted rows of leaves on scrap tiles, turning every third stem the opposite direction. When Adelaide asked why, she answered, "A pattern may carry two meanings, one for the eye and one for the person taught to read the making." Adelaide fetched a damp cloth and cleaned only the corners of the border, preserving soot elsewhere in case it contained impressions. Several tiles had been removed and replaced. Their grout was Portland cement, gray and hard, while the original lime joints had softened to cream. Each replacement bore a clumsy copy of a worker's mark. Someone had edited the pattern without understanding its ceramic language. Nell arrived after dark with 2 former pupils, Ruth Ames and Lucy Hart, carrying blankets and a pot of stew. Adelaide protested until Ruth produced her wage slip. "You said knowledge is no use if fear keeps it in a drawer," Ruth said. "Let us help for 1 hour." They numbered the tiles on scraps of paper, while Adelaide copied initials, leaf directions, and shades. Nell noticed that every 12th tile bore a tiny notch along its lower edge. When the notch tiles were read alone, their initials spelled no words, but the direction of their leaves matched turns through the pottery. left at the slip house, right at the mold loft, left again toward the kiln. The exercise became a lesson despite the cold. Adelaide divided the girls into pairs. One read marks, one checked. Then they exchanged papers and searched for disagreement. Lucy, who had always apologized before answering, discovered that 2 tiles Adelaide classified as equal blue were not equal at all. One had a violet cast produced by manganese. "Do not defer to me because I was your teacher," Adelaide said. "Evidence does not improve with obedience." Nell laughed. "Mr. Vane would call that sentence an uprising." Their humor faded when they reached 3 tiles whose initials had been scraped away. The glaze surrounding the damage was intact, proving the marks had been ground off after firing. Lucy held paper against the shallow grooves and shaded the surface with charcoal. The recovered curve suggested AV repeated twice and EC once. They entered the findings in duplicate. Nell took one copy home beneath the lining of her bonnet. Adelaide stored the other inside an empty pigment jar. What had begun as a border was now a document, and documents attracted hands eager to improve the past. The route ended at a narrow drainage channel blocked with hardened clay. Beneath its iron grate lay a glazed ceramic tube, dry despite the rain. Adelaide fed a length of twine through it. The twine traveled toward the sealed kiln and stopped after 26 feet. The next morning, Vane arrived in a closed carriage. He offered to cancel the rates and pay Adelaide £10 if she returned the deed. His explanation, that the ruin offended visitors approaching his new canal warehouse, was too smooth. He toured the yard without requesting permission, tapping brickwork with his silver-headed cane. He paused at the restored pump and the stacked slates, then glanced toward the clean section of tile border. The pause was brief but unmistakable. "Your mother had the same weakness," he said. "She confused skill with entitlement." Adelaide had not told him which mark she had found. "You remember her work?" Everyone remembers a troublesome employee. Miriam had always said she left Brackenmere before it failed because Adelaide's father found work in another county. Vane's words suggested a harsher departure. Adelaide wanted to demand the truth, but anger would reveal what she did not know. She asked instead why his warehouse fence crossed the loading right named in her deed. "An obsolete boundary," he replied. "A registered easement is not made obsolete by your convenience." The cane stopped tapping. Vane revised his offer to £15, conditional upon immediate possession. Adelaide understood then that he feared not one object inside the kiln, but the reopening of the site as a working property. Access, records, and witnesses would accumulate if she remained. "Yesterday it was worthless," she said. "Yesterday you had not begun trespassing in unsafe structures." He knew she had found something. Adelaide declined. Before leaving, Vane informed her that no carpenter employed by his companies would work at Brackenmere. By sunset, 2 merchants had refused her credit. Pike brought discarded laths from his shed. The girls collected intact slates from the collapsed packing house. Together they made the decorating room weathertight, cleared one fireplace, and repaired the hand pump after Adelaide found that its leather valve had been installed backward. The water ran rusty, then clear. People passing on the canal path began to pause. Some laughed. Mrs. Hester Vale, who kept the baker's shop, sent bruised apples and charged nothing. These repeated Vane's warning that Adelaide meant to incite women to abandon honest work. On the 5th day, Adelaide tested fragments from the false wall. Ordinary mortar would soften slightly in vinegar. This binder did not. Mixed into it was fired grog and powdered glass, a heat-resistant cement used near kiln crowns. Whoever sealed the wicket had intended it to survive fire and careless demolition. She also found fresh gray dust below the lowest brick. The intruder had returned. Rather than open the wall, Adelaide set a simple trap, a thread across the kiln house door, attached to a stack of broken saggers. Near midnight, they crashed. She reached the yard in time to see a broad-shouldered figure vanish over the canal wall. On the floor lay a pry bar stamped VMC, Vane Manufacturing Company. Constable Rusk accepted the bar but called it common company property. He seemed more concerned that young women had been present after dark. The following morning, the demolition committee advanced its inspection by 3 days. Adelaide now had 4 days to show public value. A hidden chamber she dared not open was not proof. She turned to what the pottery could make. In a sound test kiln no taller than her shoulder, she and Pike arranged a small firing. Brackenmere's clay pit was unusable, so Mrs. Vale persuaded a tile maker upriver to sell them half a cart of clay on credit. Adelaide prepared a plain cream body and mixed cobalt pigment according to the proportions she remembered from Miriam's box. The former pupils pressed alphabet tiles in salvaged molds, not ornaments but durable reading sets a child could arrange into words. The firing consumed less coal than Pike expected because Adelaide narrowed the firemouth and repaired a cracked damper. At dawn, they drew 43 sound tiles. Their blue letters shone against warm cream. The firing had not been easy. Smoke entered the room when a bird's nest blocked the upper flue. Lucy burned 2 fingers lifting a hot prop before Pike knocked it from her hand, and Adelaide made everyone rehearse signals before permitting the fire to rise. They took turns through the night, feeding coal, checking cones made from known clay mixtures, recording the color within the chamber, and resting on sacks near the wall. At 2 in the morning, Nell admitted that her father had forbidden her to return. Vane's rent collector had warned him their cottage could be inspected for overcrowding. Adelaide told Nell to go home. "If I go because he threatens our roof," Nell said, "he will threaten it every time I read something he dislikes." Adelaide could not praise courage that another family might pay for. She promised that no pupil would be named on sales or public notices without consent. She also began a hardship account in a ruled notebook, entering the loaf, blankets, labor hours, and borrowed clay. If Brackenmere survived, generosity would become shares rather than favors forgotten by the fortunate. When the kiln cooled, 7 tiles had warped and 5 showed crawling glaze. Adelaide placed the failures beside the soundware. A True Works kept its mistakes visible. Pike weighed the coal and calculated that her altered damper saved nearly 1 sack in a small firing. On a full kiln, the saving could determine whether Brackenmere competed or failed. The girls cheered softly. Adelaide held the letter M, thinking of her mother. Inside the glaze box, beneath the removable mixing slab, her thumb found a folded strip of paper she had never noticed. Heat from the kiln had loosened the old animal glue. The paper bore Miriam's handwriting. "Color is the count. Leaves are the road. Ask Samuel what the bell failed to ring." Pike turned pale when shown the message. On Brackenmere's last firing day, the yard bell should have rung after the kiln reached its finishing heat. It never did. A false alarm from the canal had drawn workers outside. When they returned, Renford's office was burning and the kiln records were gone. Pike had always blamed himself for leaving his post. "Your mother said the fire was set to cover a theft," he whispered. "She made me promise silence after men followed her home." Adelaide studied the blue alphabet tiles beside the old border. Color was the count. Cobalt changed predictably through successive heat ranges, from gray-blue to saturated dark. She sorted the notched tiles by shade rather than position. Their initials produced 3 names: Miriam Rowan, Samuel Pike, and Elias Cuff. Elias Cuff had been Brackenmere's kiln fireman. His cottage still stood near the abandoned clay pits, occupied by his widowed daughter, Agnes Cuff. Agnes at first refused to speak. Only when Pike confessed that Miriam had preserved his name did she bring out a cracked earthenware bell clapper her father had kept wrapped in felt. Inside its hollow stem was a brass key, green with age. "Father said it belonged to the chamber that could not burn," Agnes said. "He died believing the wrong men owned everything his hands had built." The key fit a small iron socket concealed beneath the kiln's wicket plate. Turning it withdrew 2 internal bolts. The false wall did not collapse. It released inward by 1/2 inch. Renford had designed it as a heat door disguised with sacrificial brick. Adelaide would not enter until Pike shored the lintel and Thomas Bell witnessed the opening. The borough clerk came reluctantly, carrying the missing early survey he claimed to have found misfiled. Its dimensions confirmed the 4-foot cavity. Behind the door was not treasure, but a narrow, dry service chamber lined in glazed brick. Copper canisters stood on shelves above the floor. A scale model of an unfamiliar kiln occupied a stone bench, its flues divided into branching channels. Rolled drawings lay inside a ceramic cylinder sealed with wax. On the back wall, dozens of finished tiles formed a panel showing workers beneath a clean sky. The chamber smelled of cold mineral dust rather than rot. Its glazed lining had shed the little moisture that entered, and each shelf stood on ceramic feet above a drainage groove. Renford had designed preservation into the structure. Even so, Adelaide saw green corrosion at one canister seam and stopped Bell from forcing it. She warmed the room gradually with lamps placed outside the threshold so sudden heat would not condense water on cold metal. Using clean linen from Mrs. Vale, she lifted loose dust and wrapped the canisters before moving them. Bell wrote a number for every object. Pike read the numbers aloud. Adelaide checked them. The care frustrated Bell at first, then persuaded him that she sought proof rather than plunder. The kiln model had removable sections held by small brass pins. When Adelaide lifted its crown, channels appeared that returned hot gases beneath the firing floor before releasing them into the chimney. Conventional bottle kilns threw much of their heat upward. This design asked the flame to perform more work and allowed smoke to burn a second time. Beside the model lay fired test rings, each cut at one point. Their gaps narrowed in a sequence measuring expansion. Miriam's initials appeared beside the smallest figures. Adelaide touched none of them, but grief came with such force that she gripped the bench. Her mother had not merely mixed colors. She had helped solve the dangerous relation between heat, clay, and masonry on which the invention depended. Pike removed his cap. They told us she stole a recipe. Did you believe them? No, but I let them say it. Adelaide understood the confession as the wound of an old man who had needed wages and possessed children to feed. Justice that required past courage from the powerless would excuse every powerful thief. She asked him to tell the truth now, while witnesses could still record it. Adelaide resisted the urge to touch everything. She recorded each object in Bell's presence. One canister held glaze trials. Another contained minutes of the Brackenmere Mutual Improvement Society. A third held wage contributions, carefully listed, toward the purchase of the works. The drawings described Renford and Miriam Rowan's return draft smoke-consuming kiln, designed to reduce coal use and the black smoke that sickened nearby families. The patent petition had never been filed. At the bottom of the cylinder lay a trust deed bearing Renford's seal. It promised the pottery, inventions, and profits to named worker members after his death. Yet the paper lacked the final registration endorsement. It might prove intention, not ownership. Bell's expression hardened as he read the witnesses' names. One signature is Elias Cuff's. The other is Arthur Vane's. Edwin's father had witnessed the deed he later claimed did not exist. Before they could remove the records, smoke curled beneath the kiln house door. Someone had ignited oil-soaked packing straw in the yard. Adelaide ordered Bell to carry the deed while she and Pike moved the canisters into the service chamber and closed its fire door. Nell rang the long, silent yard bell. Canal boatmen heard it and came running with buckets. The fire consumed a shed and scorched the kiln house, but the patched pump supplied enough water to save the main range. For 20 minutes the yard became smoke, shouted numbers, and water flashing orange in lamplight. Adelaide assigned one line to the pump and one to the canal. She ordered the girls away from the kiln crown when heated brick began to spit. Pike crawled beneath the smoke to close the test kiln's iron damper, preventing sparks from drawing through the connecting flue. A burning roof strip fell across the doorway. Nell tried to reach the glaze box inside the decorating room, Adelaide caught her skirt and dragged her backward an instant before plaster struck the place where she had stood. "No object is worth you," Adelaide shouted. "The records! We are the records if we live to testify." The sentence steadied them both. They formed another line. Mrs. Vale arrived in her nightdress beneath a man's greatcoat, carrying buckets from the bakery. Even Constable Rusk worked the pump until his hands bled. When rain finally strengthened, steam rose from black puddles and the old bell continued to swing without sound, its cracked clapper held safely in Agnes Cuff's cottage. At dawn, Adelaide counted people before property. Lucy coughed but breathed freely. Pike had a blistered wrist. One boatman required stitches. Only after their injuries were tended did she inspect the chamber. Its heat door had blackened, yet the linen-wrapped canisters within remained cool. Renford's design had survived the kind of destruction for which it was created. Constable Rusk found a Vane mill oil flask in the ash. Vane declared it planted. He also obtained an emergency injunction preventing Adelaide from removing or using any property found on premises, subject to disputed debt. Pritchard asserted that the transfer deed covered land and ruins, but excluded commercial instruments and papers formerly belonging to the Brackenmere Company. For the first time, Adelaide feared she had accepted a trap too deep to escape. The rates remained due. The roof was failing. Her discovery could be locked in litigation until Vane purchased the property at auction. Worse, Ruth Ames was dismissed from the mill for ringing the fire alarm, though she had not done it. Adelaide offered her the little money left from alphabet tile sales. Ruth refused. "Make work here," she said. "That is what frightens him." Adelaide chose to protect the records before protecting her own claim. With Bell's written consent, she placed the sealed canisters in the borough strongroom, where neither party could alter them. She gave Agnes Cuff the brass key and asked Pike to keep the ceramic clapper. No single person could open the chamber or control the evidence. Then she reopened the decorating room as a free evening class. Vane retaliated by calling in Brackenmere's oldest mortgage. Pritchard produced an account showing £68 in principal and interest. Adelaide examined it as she had taught her pupils to examine wage slips. The totals were neat, but quarterly interest had been charged after the mortgage was supposedly assigned to Vane, while the principal remained unchanged through 2 recorded payments. She asked Nell to add the columns independently. They discovered the account balanced only if one payment of £20 had been entered as a new debt. The erased payer's name left impressions on the page. Adelaide laid thin paper over it and rubbed lightly with graphite. Brackenmere Mutual Improvement Society. The workers had paid toward ownership, and Vane's account had transformed their payment into a liability. Pritchard demanded the paper back. Adelaide surrendered it only after Bell and Mrs. Vale had seen the impression. That night, the patched roof supports were sawn nearly through. Rainwater flooded the decorating room, ruining clay, books, and half the alphabet tiles. A falling beam struck Pike's shoulder and pinned him until the girls lifted it. The doctor said no bones were broken, but Pike would not work for weeks. Adelaide sat beside the wreckage at dawn, soaked and exhausted. The demolition inspection was the next day. She could not repair the roof, pay the rates, or operate safely. For several minutes she believed Vane had been right. Reading a record was not the same as surviving the power behind it. She blamed herself with an efficiency she would never have applied to a pupil. She had invited the girls, failed to discover the sawn braces, spent money on a firing while the main roof remained weak, and mistaken a temporary reprieve for security. Her mother's box lay split beneath plaster. Most of its bottles survived, but a packet of handwritten glaze notes had dissolved into blue-gray pulp. Mrs. Vale found Adelaide trying to separate the wet sheets. The baker did not offer false comfort. She set down hot broth and said Pike would recover, the roof would cost money they did not have, and self-reproach would neither dry paper nor identify a saboteur. "Choose the loss that must be saved first," she said. Adelaide chose people. She closed the unsafe rooms, sent Lucy to fetch the doctor for Pike, and used the remaining sales money to pay 2 laborers unconnected to Vane to erect a barrier. Then she chose evidence. Every damaged note was laid between clean blotting sheets in the driest surviving cupboard. Only afterward did she consider the inspection. Former pupils arrived one by one before their mill shifts. Some brought pennies, one brought a hinge. Nell's father, despite his fear, brought seasoned boards from a dismantled bed and worked silently beside his daughter. Their help could not rebuild the range, but it made one truth visible. Brackenmere already served a public beyond Adelaide. Then she saw the water on the floor, flowing around the old border tiles. At every dark cobalt tile the grout remained dry. Those tiles were thicker. Adelaide removed one loosened by the fallen beam. Its back carried numbers scratched before firing. 4, 11, 3. The next dark tile read 2, 7, 6. They were references not to letters, but to the society minutes, page, line, and word. With Bell supervising access to the canisters, Adelaide decoded the sequence. The message directed readers to duplicate enrollment beneath school hearth, witnessed Founders' Night. Brackenmere's original schoolroom had become Vane's first mill office. Its hearth still existed behind paneling. Obtaining entry required a magistrate's order. Vane argued that Adelaide's cipher was invention and the trust deed void. Bell, no longer cautious, swore to the physical evidence and altered survey. Agnes produced Elias Cuff's diary, which recorded the Founders' Night signing. Pike identified the ceramic clapper and explained the false alarm. Mrs. Vale testified to the mortgage impression. The magistrate granted a limited inspection with both parties present. Behind the mill office hearthstone, they found a second enrollment list, sealed inside a salt-glazed box. It named 112 worker members, stated their contributions, and bore the borough clerk's embossed receipt for registration fees. Attached was a letter from Arthur Vane, acknowledging that he had agreed to deliver the final trust papers to the county registry. He never had. Edwin Vane's composure cracked. He claimed his father had merely protected ignorant laborers from a reckless scheme. Adelaide answered that the question was not whether Arthur approved, but whether he had concealed a trust, falsified its debts, and profited from its designs. The last point remained unproved until she compared the model kiln with the furnaces at Vane's newest mill. The branching return flues were identical in principle. Miriam's glaze trials included precise expansion marks used to calculate heat. Vane's mill had adopted the smoke-consuming system without credit, lowering its coal costs for 15 years. Adelaide prepared her evidence as a lesson. Model, drawings, dated tiles, mill construction invoices, mortgage figures, and witness statements, each supporting the next. At the public hearing, Vane's counsel tried to dismiss her as a dismissed teacher dabbling in manufacture. "I was trained in ceramic chemistry and kiln practice by Miriam Rowan," Adelaide said. "Her name appears on the trials your client used. I was dismissed because I taught women to test figures. I have tested his." Nell and 6 pupils recalculated the mortgage before the committee. Pike demonstrated the model's dampers with one arm in a sling. Agnes read her father's diary entry. Bell admitted his office had yielded to pressure when records were withdrawn, then produced the early survey and registration receipt. The hearing occupied 2 full days in the borough assembly room. On the first, Vane's counsel separated every fact from the next until the story appeared to be a heap of coincidences. An old tile border, an unregistered intention, a copied flue, a confused laborer's memory. He asked Pike why an honest man had remained silent for 19 years. Pike answered that honesty did not abolish hunger. He had 4 children when Brackenmere closed, and every pottery accepting Vane's orders had been warned against him. When Agnes took the stand, counsel suggested that Elias Cuff invented his diary to soothe the humiliation of losing his place. Agnes opened the volume to earlier pages recording births, coal prices, minor repairs, and the weather on firing days. Bell compared its ink and aging across entries. The contested account belonged to the same continuous hand. Small, ordinary truths protected the important one. Adelaide spent the night arranging objects on Mrs. Vale's bakery table. She refused to rely upon eloquence. Each claim received a physical companion: the original share label beside the society enrollment, the coded tile rubbing beside Miriam's note, the kiln model beside Vane's masonry invoice, the old survey beside photographs Bell had commissioned of the false wall. Nell created a large calculation sheet that even people at the back could follow. On the second day, workers filled the public gallery. Overseers recorded their names, but they stayed. Adelaide began with a single cream tile bearing Miriam's initials. She explained clay body, pigment, notch, and firing shade in plain words. Then she placed the tile into its position on a drawn copy of the border. One object became a route. The route led to a chamber. The chamber held records. The records pointed to a duplicate that hostile hands had failed to find. Counsel asked whether any uneducated painter could have made the same marks by accident. "One mark certainly," Adelaide said. 100 coordinated marks, fired in ordered shades, aligned with architectural turns, and confirmed by a written key? No. Accident does not maintain a filing system. Quiet laughter moved through the gallery. The committee chairman suppressed it, though his own mouth twitched. Vane's flaw was the certainty that work done by women and laborers could be taken without leaving an intelligible record. Under questioning, he insisted the kiln design belonged to his company because his father had paid for its removal and practical adoption. The statement contradicted his earlier claim that the drawings were worthless property unrelated to his mills. His own construction invoices supplied the date of appropriation. The committee suspended demolition. The county court later recognized the registered society enrollment and imposed a constructive trust over Brackenmere's land and surviving assets. Vane was ordered to repay diverted contributions and profits attributable to the design, less legitimate expenses to be determined by an independent accountant. Pritchard lost his borough appointments after altered mortgage entries, and the concealed survey were traced through his office. Evidence concerning the fires and sabotage went to the assizes. The night watchman confessed that Vane's foreman had paid him to frighten Adelaide away. Edwin Vane was not ruined in an afternoon, but he lost control of the trust, his public offices, and the silence on which his authority depended. The legal victory arrived in installments rather than thunder. The first order protected the property but released no money. The second appointed an accountant whom neither side could dismiss. Vane appealed the society's standing, challenged Elias Cuff's diary, and claimed the registration receipt referred to a charitable club rather than ownership. Each delay consumed coal, food, and patience. Adelaide traveled twice to the county town in third-class carriages, carrying documents in a tin dispatch case chained to her wrist. She learned the difference between moral certainty and admissible proof. The tile cipher explained where to search, but the court relied upon the receipt, enrollment, boundary survey, witness testimony, and Vane correspondence. Miriam's technical trials established authorship only when paired with dated purchase orders showing that Vane's masons built matching flues. At the final accounting, the cooperative did not receive the fantastic fortune rumored in public houses. Some profits could not be traced. Some expenditures had genuinely preserved structures. The judge rejected Adelaide's demand for every year of Vane's coal savings, but allowed compensation for the documented use of the design and the diverted worker payments, with interest. It was enough to begin, not enough to make prudence unnecessary. The arson case produced similarly measured consequences. The foreman admitted ordering the first attempted entry and arranging the yard fire, but denied authorizing danger to life. Vane denied instructing him. Correspondence proved pressure and payment, not the precise words spoken. The foreman was convicted. Vane faced civil liability and removal from the borough committee, rather than the dramatic imprisonment many expected. Adelaide accepted no private settlement requiring silence. Public findings mattered because another employer might otherwise repeat the method. Victory did not mend the roof. The court released a modest interim sum, enough to stabilize one kiln range, drain the yard, and settle the rates, not enough to restore the entire works. Adelaide and the surviving members formed the Brackenmere Cooperative under new rules. One recorded vote per member, published accounts, schooling hours protected, and no debt contracted without open approval. Work proceeded through winter and spring. Masons rebuilt the damaged gable in stages. Pike supervised kiln repairs from a chair until his shoulder healed. Agnes managed the firing records, keeping duplicates in 2 locations. Nell became the cooperative's first paid clerk and continued her lessons at night. Ruth and Lucy produced alphabet tiles, household crocks, and smoke-resistant chimney liners based on the recovered clay research. The first cooperative meeting nearly failed over questions that Victory had postponed. Older throwers believed voting shares should follow years in the craft. Younger painters argued that the women who saved the records deserved equal weight. Canal laborers wanted payment for fighting the fire. Descendants of original members asked whether inheritance entitled them to profits without work. Adelaide could have used her public standing to force a settlement. Instead, she wrote every proposal on the wall and required its cost to be calculated. The original trust distinguished ownership from employment but granted 1 vote to every active member. Descendants retained a limited claim to the recovered compensation, while new earnings belonged to those producing them. Firefighters received payment from the emergency fund before any dividend. The rules disappointed everyone slightly, which Mrs. Vale considered evidence of fairness. They elected Adelaide superintendent for 1 year, not for life. She accepted on condition that Nell countersign purchases and that quarterly accounts be read aloud. Her first budget was grim. Stabilizing the gable consumed £28. Drainage and a safe chimney required 16 more. Coal, clay, wages, insurance, and cartage left little for the school. They opened only 3 evenings each week and charged buyers a farthing extra per alphabet set to support books. Skill had to be rebuilt as carefully as masonry. Pike taught 2 boys to center clay on a wheel with less strength and more balance than they imagined possible. Agnes reconstructed firing logs from Miriam's temperature rings. Adelaide taught painters to prepare consistent cobalt washes, but her first batch varied because the recovered mineral contained grit. Lucy devised a settling jar, marked with timed levels, producing a cleaner pigment. Adelaide entered Lucy's name beside the improvement. That entry mattered. Brackenmere's old injustice had begun when powerful men treated knowledge as ownerless whenever it came from a worker. The new pottery could not honor Miriam while repeating the theft against a younger woman. Housing presented another test. Ruth lost her mill cottage after taking permanent work at Brackenmere. The cooperative could not afford to build homes, so it repaired 2 rooms above the counting house with a separate stair and charged a modest rent recorded as income. When 3 other families asked for rooms, Adelaide refused to crowd them into unsafe lofts. Popularity did not make a rotten beam sound. By March, the loading stage dispute was settled in Brackenmere's favor. Workers removed Vane's encroaching fence under a surveyor's eye. The first coal boat turned within the restored boundary with inches to spare. Men along the towpath cheered, not because a fence was grand, but because a line on an old deed had become usable ground again. Adelaide refined the return draft kiln rather than pretending an old model required no improvement. The first full firing failed along one side, blistering a quarter of the wear. She recorded the loss openly. After adjusting 2 flues and reducing the final heat, the second firing used nearly a third less coal than neighboring works and sent only a pale haze above the bottle kiln. The failed firing threatened more than pride. A school board order for 600 letter tiles had a fixed delivery date, and Brackenmere had spent the advance on clay and coal. Adelaide slept 4 hours in 3 days while sorting salvageable ware. She proposed purchasing replacement tiles from a rival and painting them at Brackenmere, which would preserve the contract but erase most profit. Pike offered another solution. Many blistered tiles were sound around their edges. Cut smaller, they could form word counters for infant classes. Adelaide disliked asking the buyer to accept altered goods, but Nell reminded her that concealment had been Vane's method. They sent samples and a full explanation. The school board accepted half the order as smaller counters at a reduced price and extended the balance by 10 days. For the second firing, Adelaide did not merely copy the model. She placed Miriam's expansion rings at 3 chamber levels, compared their contraction, and found the lower return flue drawing too strongly. Lucy's settling jars provided ceramic plugs of consistent thickness. Adjusting the plugs balanced the heat. When the kiln cooled, sound cream tiles filled every sagger but one. Adelaide entered the failure first, then the success, in the public log. Visitors who came expecting a miraculous recovered invention found instead measurements, revisions, and hands blackened by work. That truth proved more persuasive to practical manufacturers than legend would have been. Orders came first from schools, then from towns seeking cleaner municipal ovens. Profits were divided among wages, repairs, the education fund, and reserves. The poisoned pit was fenced rather than miraculously cured. Clean clay arrived by canal until drainage engineers could assess the ground. One roofless range remained a ruin, ivy removed but stones untouched, a reminder that restoration had limits as well as hope. Miriam Rowan's name appeared on the kiln license beside Renford's, Pike's, and Cuff's, followed by every contributor identified in the records. Adelaide declined to place her own name among the original inventors. Her work had been interpretation and improvement, worthy without pretending to be creation. The cooperative registered Lucy's settling process separately and paid her a small royalty on pigment prepared by it. The education room expanded slowly. Its first shelves held donated primers, trade manuals, and ledgers, rather than ornamental volumes. Lessons included reading, arithmetic, drawing, household accounts, and the chemistry of materials. Mill girls attended beside apprentices and boatmen. Some learned only enough to verify a wage slip. Others remained to study design. Adelaide regarded neither purpose as inferior. When Nell's younger brother brought a contract from another factory, 3 pupils found a deduction disguised as equipment hire. They wrote a respectful query, supported it with arithmetic, and recovered 2 shillings for every worker who had signed the same form. No hidden chamber was required. Brackenmere's legacy had become ordinary vigilance, repeated wherever a figure could be checked. Not everyone in town changed. Some manufacturers called Brackenmere an indulgence certain to fail. Several parents still forbade daughters to attend lessons. But boatmen chose its loading stage, shopkeepers extended ordinary credit, and families who had once lowered their voices near Vane's overseers began asking to see the cooperative accounts. On the anniversary of the dismissal, Adelaide stood in the rebuilt decorating room before 40 pupils. The original border tiles remained in place, including Miriam's mark. Above the hearth hung no portrait of a benefactor. Instead, the workers' tile panel from the hidden chamber had been mounted where daylight could reach it. Men and women beneath a sky cleared of smoke, every maker's initial visible. Nell set the old schoolroom keys on Adelaide's desk. She had recovered them when Vane's school closed and its pupils transferred to Brackenmere. "Shall we keep them?" she asked. Adelaide considered the keys that had once signified another man's permission. Then she placed them in a shallow dish of wet clay and pressed until their teeth left a clean impression. "We will keep the pattern," she said, "and make something useful from it." Outside, the cooperative bell rang, the end of the firing. No false alarms scattered the workers. They crossed the yard together as the kiln doors opened and a restrained warmth entered the cold morning. Adelaide lifted the first cream-colored reading tile from its sagger. The letter was A, painted in Miriam's deep, enduring blue.